I got 3 Sammys now. That's a lot of Sammys. Okay, so the live response lab is due today, unless, yeah, so I won't be getting that one back to you until after the break. But I should get it back to you within the week that we get back, probably on the Friday, I would guess. The live response quiz I can discuss right now if people want to, because I think there's some instructive stuff. I don't have the marks back yet. I'll get those back to you, but I can talk about it now, I think, so maybe I'll do that. And then today we're going to kick off the part 3 of the course, which is the offline analysis stuff. This is really the classic forensics, right? I should just check everybody hear me okay, right? Excuse me. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so what we're going to get into here, it's more about static data on captured images. I will deal with RAM a little bit, which is a little bit of a fuzzy, pun intended, but it's a bit of a fuzzy in between in terms of being offline versus live response. But it's enough offline that I included in the offline part. But you'll see that it's kind of, it kind of occupies a gray zone. So whereas before, when we were doing live response, it's a little less formal. It's a little more seat of your pants. You're having to respond in time, right? What we're getting to now is you've already done the capture of material. You're dealing largely with non-volatile data, and then you're looking at the artifacts that you've collected and analyzing all the metadata associated with it to figure out what's going on. Okay, so it's a bit of a different beast. It's much more picky. You have to be very selective, making sure that you're not spoiling the data. Okay, so this is kind of, you got to ramp up your carefulness in terms of handling things when you're working with this one. Okay, so we'll be starting to get into that. And some of the things we're going to look at is data recovery, file identification, and those kind of go together. Okay, so if you've got, if somebody deletes a whole bunch of files, you'll have some data recovery that you might have to do. You might also be in the position where you can recover the data, but you can't recover the file types. You have to figure it out, right? And there are tools for that kind of thing. Now, there's also disk image capture, so capturing hard disks, whether that's an SSD or whether that's a spindle drive. They both, they follow similar procedures, but they have their own little quirks. Okay. There's RAM gathering, so that's how is it that you actually capture an image of RAM? That's going to be the very first thing that we do. I'm going to run through a RAM analysis case study where I'll walk through an exercise with you just to kind of go over various steps in the process and discuss what they mean, because it's a little bit more advanced, but also useful, And then what is it that people do to hide and cover their tracks on a file system, which means that we have to understand how file systems work, what data we can get off of file systems, not in terms of the files themselves, but information about the files, right? So sometimes you don't even get the file, but you know that the file existed because the file system still has a record of it. Things like that. And I'm going to come back and do email forensics because we never did finish that one off. And that'll all be good preparation for the lab when it comes out. Okay. Now you got a couple of quizzes that are going to come up here. They're a bit of a ways off, but there's the RAM analysis quiz. So we're going to do RAM early so that you have a bit of time to practice it before we actually get to a quiz. Okay. And then there's the hiding quiz, which is actually pretty easy. Not that bad anyways. I'll talk about that as we get closer to it. But I always save the easy ones for last, just so we have a kind of a smooth ride out into the sunset at the end of a course. Okay, so any questions before I get started on things? Anything I didn't mention that you want to raise? Okay, so what we're going to be doing here is I'm going to do a lecture on conducting an investigation. Okay. And we're going to go to the binary images section for exercises. So I've got that ready to go, but this is what we'll be talking. This is just an intro to the topic of the third part of the course here. Oh yeah, and before I do that, let me let's see. So the live response quiz, I will get it back to you before the break, either today or tomorrow, I would say. But let me go over that real quick. Because there are some interesting things here, and I don't want to forget. I figure when you were working on it, you probably encountered some interesting things. Why is this so high? 100. There we go. All right, so you had to install that piece of software on some random Windows 10 system or what have you. Installed a service called the Query Broker, right? Now, when I ask you for the log entry, there should be an entry indicating that that service got created or that the service started. I didn't really mind which one you gave me. I think it just indicates that one was created, but I can't quite remember. But nobody tends to have too much trouble finding this. You just look at the right time, which is pretty much at the time that you do the install. You go into the system section and you should be able to find it, right? So that's kind of an easy gimme. But then it gets a little weird where it says locate the query broker executable that the service runs and take a screenshot of the executable in File Explorer. Now, it says that it's in Windows System 32, but when you actually go and try and access it, so let me just get into Explorer here. So you got C, Windows, System 32. And it's saying, yeah, it's right here. And then when you actually go and try and take a screenshot of it, it's not actually there, right? Which causes the first level of confusion that people are like, what the heck is going on here, right? This is actually normal behavior in Windows, and it has to do with 32-bit applications versus 64-bit applications, okay? So if you're running on a 64-bit architecture, like everybody is these days typically, you may still be running 32-bit apps. And the question is, how does that work? Okay. And the answer is there's a certain level of emulation that occurs. Basically, 64-bit instructions, like architecture, CPUs, are able to run 32-bit code. Okay. So if I take a 32-bit application, I can still run it on Windows 10 or what have you. The thing is, the operating system decides to separate those two types of files out. So if you're running, this is where it gets really weird, okay? C Windows System 32 is a default folder that's been around for a long time, right? And you would think that that indicates that is where all the 32-bit apps are, but that's not true at all. They keep the name of that folder for compatibility reasons, okay? But actually, all of these files here are 64-bit files, okay? If you have a 32-bit file that needs to be in System 32, it gets automatically shunted over to SysWow 64. And so there's this whole other world of different files, which are 32-bit, which go into the 64 folder, the SysWow 64 folder, okay? So the query broker executable, even though it says it's in System 32, it's actually getting deposited in here because it's a 32-bit app, and the operating system just papers it all over, okay? So when you go to System 32, like say you call on an app, it'll go to 32, and if it doesn't see it there, it'll check in 64. It's like this automatic process that goes on with 64-bit operating systems to maintain support for 32-bit apps. Okay, so obviously that can not only confuse but actually, make it kind of interesting when you're doing investigations, right? Now, how would you have figured that out? Well, when I ask you to take the image, you're going to see that the file's not there. And then, there are different ways to actually locate it, but one way is with the task manager, right? So if you actually see the executable, you go and find it, or auto runs will also tell you where it is. When you actually go to that location, it'll take you to syswow 64. Okay. Now, the weird part beyond that is that the event log entry actually mentions 32, system 32, even though that's not true. And that's because the operating system papers over those differences. So if you refer to 32, it'll still find that executable for you. Okay. So the path provided by the log file entry is misleading. Okay, so we find that in syswow 64, which most people did. Determine the type of startup the query broker service is configured for. I give you 4 choices, right? Manual, automatic delayed, or disabled startup. Now, there's a couple of things here. If you go to services.msc, then you'll see that it was automatic delayed. Okay. But if you go to the registry, it could mislead you and make you think that it's automatic. And again, if you go to the log file, the event log, it'll also say automatic rather than automatic delayed. Okay. So, and that's because automatic delayed was an additional add-on with just an extra entry in the registry that was separate from the first 3 that were created, which was manual, automatic, and disabled. Okay, so Microsoft kind of massaged what you could do by adding automatic delayed with a separate registry entry, which slows down the process of starting that particular service. So again, it depends where you're looking for data. And my point with all of these is that you have to double check everything that you're doing, right? Because sometimes the information you get is not, you look at it casually and you're like, yeah, this is the answer. And then it turns out it's not actually true, right? So you always want to cross-reference if you can. Okay. There's servany.exe. I point that out. Prove that querybroker.exe is identical to Servany. The best way to do this is with hashing, right? If the 2 files are identical in terms of hash numbers or hash values, then they're the same file, right? Doesn't matter what you called them, right? Now, people have done other things, like they've compared sizes, they've compared creation dates or modification dates. None of those are quite the same standard of proof that a hash is. And so if you do a hash, you get the full 2 marks. If you do something else and it's better than plausible, it's very reasonable, then you'll get 1 mark, but it's not quite considered proof. Now there are a few other things which are considered full marks. So if you do a file comparison, like there are tools that'll just do a byte by byte comparison, that would totally count too. Okay, a file hash is a quick way of doing that, or it's an equivalent to doing it, but actually going in and comparing each of the bytes with an application, I would consider that valid as well. Okay. Now, Query Broker launches a randomly named executable, so you have to find that running in Task Manager or whatever other tool you use. And I'm asking for the process ID of this running process. So if you give me the process name, that's not quite right. You have to actually identify it by its ID. And then I do want a picture of that, right? So, if you just give me the name, you probably won't get any marks for that. Depending, I will look at the details and see what you provide. But for instance, if you pointed to a process ID but you didn't list it, then I would probably be like, yeah, okay, that's good enough. But that is what I'm asking for. So now the randomly named executable is using a randomly selected port. Identify the port that it is claiming and take a screenshot of your evidence proving it's running on that port. This is where people can get a little bit confused. Like the basics of it are pretty straightforward. But again, it's how you interpret the data. So if you're running TCP view, it should give you very reliable results. Okay. If you're running NetStat, um, it does give reliable results, but people often misread it. And so there's, there'll be like, it'll be something like IP address, port, application name, IP address, port, application name, right? And a whole bunch of them in a list. What people often do is that they think the application name is listed first, and then they specify the port underneath it, but actually it's the reverse way. And so they're identifying the wrong port, okay, based on misreading the output. So if you misread the output, I usually take a mark off. But if you were close, you'll lose a mark. But if you didn't quite get it, you don't get the full mark. But if you do interpret it correctly, either through TCP view or NetStat, then you get full marks for it. Okay, but it's another little gotcha about being careful about what you're looking at. And that's really the lesson, is kind of like, now that we're heading into a much more picky part of the course, it's kind of like, make sure that you double check what you're doing, right? And then prove that the randomly named executable is associated with the query broker service. Take a screenshot of your proof that the service and the executable are connected. So again, people take different approaches, and there's a couple of marks associated with this. So there are better responses, and there are, good but not as good responses. And then there are completely wrong ones, right? So if you look at the query broker service and you go into the registry, there's actually a specific string which is linking the two executables together, so that one of those executables calls on the other one. Okay, that's an absolute proof that they're connected, right? On the other hand, some people will do things like, well, I start the service and this executable starts up, and then I turn off the service and this executable disappears. That is very plausible and is very reasonable, but it's not solid proof. Okay, it's what you would call a coincidence in time. So they may be connected to each other, but you don't know exactly how or in what way. So it's a lesser proof, essentially, which would be worth half of the marks. And I do listen to your justification. So if your justification is bunk, then you lose more marks. And if it's a pretty good one, then you might actually get the full 2, depending on what you argue. Okay. So I'll have those back for you today or tomorrow. Okay, yeah. So we were going to do the intro here. Let me do that. Let's get going. Okay, so the big thing I want to bring across here is handling digital evidence. This is a lot pickier than what you're used to so far with live response, much less hacking, which is essentially vandalism, right? Now we want to be like, this is your baby, treat it like your baby, right? And we're going to talk about hearsay, which is really what's good quality evidence, okay? The hearsay rule is just a way of determining classifications of evidence. Some things are of lower quality, some things are of higher quality, okay? And we're also going to talk about time synchronization and how time is very important in building building a case and building a timeline, okay? So we will talk about the steps of an investigation, but these are the real things within it that I want to bring out, okay? So you've got a couple of broad types of investigation. There's public and private ones. The public ones usually mean that's involving the law, right? So criminal cases where really the government has a role in it. You have to follow very specific procedures, and they're very careful about making sure that evidence is handled correctly and that appropriate, cautiously determined proofs are arrived at. So drug dealing, sexual exploitation, child pornography, and even some civil cases go on to become criminal cases. All of those, they have a high level of scrutiny. right? Not just because they're public in the sense that people know what's going on, but they're overseen through public law, right? Private investigations, on the other hand, that stays within the corporation typically, or the organization. So, you may have a civil case where somebody's suing somebody else for wrongful dismissal or what have you, right? Uh, but this is not getting to the level of a crime, you know? This is more about people having a dispute, a disagreement about certain facts, and that having consequences that need to be resolved. Okay, so, um, you know, sabotage and espionage, I mean, those are actually, they fall into often criminal levels. But violation of a company's policies, people don't usually go to jail for that kind of thing, but you can get fired, right? Um, and that can lead to civil court cases. So civil court cases just means that we're not dealing with criminal law. So sometimes these overlap, sometimes one becomes another. Usually it ramps up into a criminal case from a civil case. Um, and then an example might be a worker who has pornographic material on work computers. Just having regular pornographic material would be, cause for firing maybe because you're violating company policy, right? On the other hand, if you find child porn on that employee's computer, then you're dealing with a criminal matter, and so that changes the nature of the investigation, right? So you have to be able to handle both. And you have to understand that even though you might be called in for a private investigation, it might be you who triggers the transition into a criminal investigation. And they may not like that, because companies don't really like that kind of bad publicity. So, but that's not your problem. Like it's your responsibility to report a crime, right? Now, there's all sorts of other types of forensics out there. Uh, the difference between digital forensics and, say, you know, um, chemical or biological forensics, is that digital forensics is highly fakeable, much more fakeable than all those other ones. So, if you're looking at, I don't know, let's say the Unabomber back in the 70s, right? Or was it 70s or 80s? 80s, maybe, bit of both. Um, when they were trying to figure out who he was, they would be looking for the ink that he was using to type up his letters, right? Or where he got, you know, um, where he got the material from to make his bombs, right? That's a physical type of evidence, and it is pretty hard to fake, right? Digital evidence, like not only can you fake, say, a binary, you can give it a name like servicehost.exe so that it appears to be doing something when it's actually serving another purpose. You can have things like Trojans, right, which are programs that contain other programs and do other things that you don't really understand or expect, right? But beyond that, you can actually manipulate a lot about a file and what the file system says about it. So the creation, modification, and what's the other one? And access dates for files that are tracked on the system. Uh, Most of the time, those are true and faithful, but there are tools that can fake all of those. Okay, so even looking at the time that a file was downloaded is potentially fakeable. And that means that when you're building a case using digital evidence, you you need to try and cross-confirm the data that you get. Um, just to kind of make sure that the story that you're constructing around all that data is sane, right? Um, it can be, the data can be easily damaged or deleted. And if it's deleted, it can be recovered often, okay? It can be modified, and you kind of, because of all of that, there could be accusations that when you were working on a file, um, you introduced changes into it, which make it look worse for, the defendant than it should, right? And so you have to go through a lot of hoops to prove that that's not the case. And that's where hashing comes in a lot for offline analysis, okay? So courts, when they're looking at this, they understand that because defense lawyers have really hit that home a lot, is that there's a lot of holes that you can punch through digital evidence. So we have this concept of hearsay, and hearsay is basically rumor, I would say, essentially. Okay, rumor or gossip, something that you don't hear directly. So if let's just give an example. So if a friend of yours, you go and you visit them, you go, hey, how's it going? They're like, oh, I had a bad day. And you're like, oh, what happened? He goes, oh, I hit someone with my car. Okay, and then I drove off. All right. So so your buddy did a hit and run. He told you that he did that. Him telling you that he did that, that's not hearsay. Okay. You can actually go to the police. You can tell them, yeah, this is what he told me. However, if your girlfriend says, "Oh, my friend Lisa had a really bad day. She told me that she hit someone with her car and she drove off. She got freaked out." If you go to the police with that, that is hearsay because you're hearing it through a third party. Okay. So there are protections in place in the courts, so that just hearing something through a third party does not count as proper evidence. Okay. So it's not admissible in court. Your girlfriend would have to go and provide that testimony in order for it to be considered valid. Okay. Now, digital evidence, for the most part, is considered hearsay. Okay, if it was created by a human being. So there are certain exceptions to the hearsay rule that can be admitted into court, but it's a little subtle. So email, memos, reports, records, and log files, they can be admitted, but they can also be questioned. Okay, so you have to verify, first of all, whether they're allowed to be admitted in the first place, and then the lawyers are going to try and pick them apart. Okay, so let's just talk about an email. If somebody sends an email, the fact that the email was sent and was sent by a certain person, that is admissible and that it can be considered evidence. Okay. The content in the email is not automatically considered to be true. And so that is considered to be hearsay. Okay. Same thing with a record of some type. If a dear diary, let's say, if somebody's keeping a diary of information, that information alone is not necessarily considered admissible. That's usually considered hearsay. But the details around the diary, like when it was modified, when it was created, that kind of stuff, even though it's fakeable, it is considered admissible. And then you have to fight over trying to establish whether the data is correct. Okay. Log files initiated by your computer system, those are always considered legit because it doesn't really involve human interaction. So it's just a machine recording events that's considered reliable. Okay. So anything computer generated is A-OK in terms of being usable. Okay. So log files are great. Computer stored records and files, um, those ones, it depends really, but for the most part, it's considered hearsay. Okay. Um, I mean, obviously, all files that are stored are computer stored, but the ones that are generated by the computer are solid. The ones that are generated by humans, you can glean some information off of them, but they're not gospel. Okay. So computer generated records you still got to prove that they came from the computer in question, right? They haven't been modified since they were on that system. And you have to identify, who or what created it essentially. Like, why was this created? Was it a user? Was it a computer, like a particular computer that did it? It's possible that you could be logging things on one computer but creating them on another, kind of like with syslog or forwarding events, right? And that's usually in the event logs. You can kind of figure out where it came from. Now, when it comes to actually looking over all of this stuff, what we typically do is we take an image of the media that we're working off of. Okay, so we don't work off of it directly. We just grab that image and then we work with the copy. Okay, and that's a bitstream copy. What does that mean? It means that you take a hard disk, which is really just a bunch of ones and zeros, and you turn it into a giant file of ones and zeros. Okay, and that should be an exact duplication of what's on that disk. Okay. So this should be considered a reliable working copy because it contains an exact binary duplication of the original media. So even if the original media does get lost or damaged for some reason, you still have that bitstream copy. Okay. Now what you usually do is you make that copy and then you take a hash of it. And then only after you've taken a hash of that, and it could be like a 200 gig file, right? But once you've taken a hash of that 200 gig file, then you can start to work with the 200 gig file and all of the content in it. Okay. We never really work with the original disk or media after that, unless it's to make another copy, which, like a defense attorney might want to hire somebody separate to look at the same data and they'll follow the same procedure, right? Um, Okay, so documents that actually reflect the data which is considered on the computer are considered admissible documents, right? So if you can prove, look, I followed this procedure to duplicate the image, and then I extracted these files off of the copy of the disk, and these are all the hashes, and this is how I did it, and now you can reproduce what I did, and you should get exactly the same results. This is all considered admissible, okay? Now, there are certain suites of tools that we can use for this kind of thing. So EnCase is kind of the granddaddy, which has been around a long time. FTK is kind of newer, but they're very well respected and used by law enforcement. And there's other ones out there as well. The one we're going to use is Autopsy because it's open source and free. These guys are expensive. I'll say that. I think EnCase is at least $4,000, and FTK I think is more expensive than that. So. I did talk to them once about trying to get a student copy, but it's still too expensive. So so we're going to use Autopsy. That's our poor man's version. It's actually getting used in courts more and more nowadays, partly because of the cost of the other tools, right? The problem is you have to convince the courts that the tool that you're using is reliable. So that does take time. Courts are kind of they're conservative, right? And so they're going to favor the tools that they already know. And that's why EnCase really still has a good stranglehold on the industry. Now, there's 4 basic steps when you're conducting an investigation. There's your own training, acquisition of tools, coordination with people before the event, right? In terms of gaining access and all that kind of stuff. So that's just the lead up, right? Then you have to go into data acquisition, and that's going to take a while. That's not a fast process necessarily. It's making a copy of the evidence drive or drives, because often it could be many. And you need to use something called a write blocker. Okay, a write blocker, in the ideal circumstance, it's a physical device that you plug into the hard disk, and then you plug it into the computer that the hard disk used to be connected to. And what it will do is it will block any attempts on the part of the computer to write to the disk. So you can read from the disk, but physically you have no ability to write. Okay. And that's a good approach to take, because when they're saying, how did you acquire this evidence? They're looking for opportunities to punch holes in the validity of the data, right? By attaching this write blocker onto the disk before you do your acquisition, you're essentially guaranteeing, like, this is certified hardware, you're guaranteeing that it's not possible for you to spoil the evidence when you're doing your image acquisition. Okay. Now, there are software write blockers, and that just means you're using an operating system that is only mounting the content read only. You got to be more careful with that kind of thing. That's what we're going to do in this class when we do an acquisition. And that's because write blockers, first of all, we're dealing with virtual machines. So a write blocker is not going to plug into a virtual disk. And secondly, um, they're expensive. So this is not something that we can create a whole bunch of, buy a whole bunch of copies of easily. They're probably, a couple $100 a piece kind of thing. However, those are the gold standard. So this is not a cheap profession to get into, right? So what we are going to do is we're going to build our own little forensic boot disk, which will be modified so that it doesn't do any kind of writing to any file system that it encounters. Okay, by default, it'll keep it read-only. And then you can do an acquisition that way as well. Okay, that's kind of, again, it's the poor man's version. Once you actually capture the image, you have to use special tools. We're going to use DD, which is a Linux utility, but we're going to use it on Windows. Okay, actually use it on Windows PE, and then you do a capture, and that's a bit-by-bit capture of the disk. Analyze the data. There you bring in the suite like EnCase or FTK or Autopsy, and it'll run through it for you and do a lot of work preparing things to present to you. Okay. Now, the work that it does is not the whole job. That just simplifies the task of looking for a needle in a haystack, right? There, you may have to dig down into the file system itself, into the image, to try and extract extra information that this suite is not automatically showing you. Okay. So it's up to you in the end to identify the evidence. You're the one who looks at the patterns and says, wait a minute, what's going on here? Are these things connected? It's maybe as AI gets a little better, that will change, but we're not there yet. Okay. And so as an investigator, the burden's kind of on you to figure those things out. And then present the evidence in the form of a report. And here we're getting into a much more formal reporting status. Okay. And so that's going to be the emphasis of the next lab coming up, is you're going to produce a report, actually two reports. One of them is going to be a bit of a data dump, so treat it like an appendix. And the other one's going to be kind of the higher level, this is how we interpret all that data. Okay. Okay, so what kind of tools do you need? Chain of custody document to track anything. That's not something we're going to have to worry about in this course because it's all virtualized. But normally you would track who's handling what. You're checking out physical objects potentially, or even when you're working on an image like a copy of physical media, you'd still be tracking who's working on it and what they're doing. Okay. A PC toolkit for when you're doing your capture, because you're gonna have to open up the box. You're gonna have to do things like attach a write blocker. You want a digital camera so you can record what it is. So a phone would work for this, but you want to record what it is that, the layout of the area that you're investigating, so that you can kind of show that you haven't done too much with it other than the work that you were supposed to do, right? And just to show that there were certain things on the scene at the time, and those were the things that you grabbed, right? Evidence bags, anti-static bags, so you want to label everything. You want to make sure that it doesn't get damaged. You need a heck of a lot of cables. If you're dealing with phones, it gets even worse, right? Because there's all sorts of different connectors that are out there. You want to label everything, so you want to have tag things for that. And then some kind of bootable forensic media. So it could be a DVD, could be a USB drive, but also people often bring in entire computers, which they'll then hook up disks to them to do a capture, right? So they're kind of like, like a doctor's bag from the 1900s, like the early 1900s, where they just bring the bag in, there's a whole bunch of tools in it. Essentially, you can bring in a small computer with a bunch of tools in a bag, and you can hook up whatever media you need, do your capture, and then leave with that bag, right? So there are some expensive dedicated systems that you can run, which can do their whole purpose is to do capture, and they are pretty expensive. And then hardware or software based write blockers, hardware being the favored. Okay. Now, when you're securing the scene of the incident, it really depends on the circumstance. It may be hush hush. It may be very public and cordoned off, you know. So you got to coordinate with whoever is involved. So let's say department supervisors. You may be trying to avoid confronting a suspect. You may not. It really depends. Okay, but your job is not to, you know, interview people. That's not really what this is about. That's what police do and other people. Um, but you know, supervisors or police, they may not want a worker to know that they're being investigated, in which case you have to kind of comply with that to some degree. Okay. So you kind of want to leave no traces. You want to make the system look like it hasn't really been touched. Maybe, not necessarily. Uh, you may be asked to install a keylogger to capture keystrokes if you're dealing with, like, say, a harassment case or something like that. You don't want to really, you know, like one of the reasons to take pictures is so that you can make sure everything gets put back in the right place, you know. So if you do adjust the chair height, you want to put it back. It's better not to adjust it though, just kind of leave it as it is. And photograph the work area so you can restore things to the right state later. You want to figure out what you want to take images of. So it could be disk drives. You may take an entire PC. If you're dealing with servers, RAID is a complicating factor. Okay. Um, Although RAID is not the only game in town these days, there are other types of storage solutions, but all of them can complicate recovering data. So, um, you know, and you may be dealing with removable media, flash drives, even optical storage, and phones, right? Phones are an interesting quirk. So you may decide to image at the site, or you might take the system, the entire computer, bring it over to your, um, you know, your own workspace to work on. It really depends on the situation. Now, if you're imaging a whole bunch of systems, then bringing in a single computer to just grab images, that could actually be a, what do you call it? It's like a choke point. It could actually slow down your process, right? So if you've just got a couple of disks to image, you could just do disk to disk, and that can be very effective. But if you have a lot of systems you need to image, you might want to do that over the network, okay? Network is slower one-to-one, but it's faster when you're doing a whole bunch of systems at once. Okay? So it really does, again, it depends on the circumstance and how many images you need to make. If a server needs to be imaged, I'm not going to say you should shut it down properly. There are different opinions on this. But if you are dealing with any kind of RAID, shutting it down properly is the safer option. However, you have to understand that volatile data will be lost in that process, right? So this is not a surefire strategy. You have to decide. You know, 20 years ago, it was an easy decision. You pulled the plug. That was it. And then you took an image. Okay. Um, Now, nowadays, first of all, it may be that they don't want you to bring down the server for too long, in which case, and they may need more time to prepare. So you might have to coordinate some kind of failover, um, or it depends on the seriousness of the situation, right? So you may also just end up pulling the plug and capturing. So it really does depend. It's partly up to the employer, but it also could be law enforcement. Now, interacting with suspects, really, this is not something that you should have to do too much, but it may be, you know, you may be walked in on or something like that. You should have a good story if you have to be surreptitious about it, okay? And keep in mind, like, it's not really up to you to determine the truth or innocence. You're just generating a report here. With what specs? Specs. What are you talking about? Suspects. Yeah, with whatever suspects. Sus. Pets. Okay, I'm moving on. But keep in mind, your suspect may be innocent, right? So it's not really your job to assume that they're guilty or anything like that. It's not your job to prove. You're just there to gather evidence and then look through the evidence and present that report. You got to inventory everything. That's part of the process. So anything you grab, you're taking down serial numbers, taking photos of it, handling it carefully, tagging it, making sure that it's protected, right? And then you're going to put it somewhere safe. So, that could be a police locker, but it could be a safe if you're a contractor, it could just be a safe in your office. Right? Now, one of the other things you have to think about, and this is not necessarily under your control, but it's time synchronization. This can impact your ability to reconstruct what happened on systems. Okay, so there's a protocol called Network Time Protocol, which in a server environment, you can set that up so that all of the servers synchronize to the same time, okay? And they're really going out to an external service, and they're syncing with that, which makes them sync with each other, okay? That's in the Linux world. Now, in the Windows world, if you're joined to a domain controller, the domain controller is usually the time server, and it kind of makes the clients synchronize with it, okay? Um, and I've seen this in the labs where if you do that and you don't synchronize with an external time server, what will happen is that all of your clients will drift with the domain controller. And so over time, all of your machines will get out of time sync with the real world, but they will remain in sync with each other. Okay. The thing is, time synchronization is very important when you're reconstructing logs, event logs, okay? Especially if machines are talking to each other. In a domain environment, if there's a lack of synchronization of more than a few minutes, then people won't be able to log in. Like a client that's desynced with the server in terms of time, if you've got a 5-minute gap, you're not able to log into that machine. And so there's a certain amount of automatic time synchronization, which is occurring in a Windows domain. But if you're in something like let's say Azure AD, right? Time synchronization is not as important in that kind of environment. And so you could have computers that are drifting significantly away from what's happening on the domain controller, let's say, right? So when you're using Kerberos, you can reliably expect that the machines are kind of working on the same page. But if you're dealing with something like cloud-based authentication, you don't have that assurance, and that can introduce real confusion when it comes to reconstructing what happened when. Okay. So just something to be aware of. Now, time synchronization is a must because if there's enough of a discrepancy, then defense attorneys can poke holes in what actually happened, right? So you have to take account of any kind of drift that's occurring and be able to account for that in the construction of a timeline that you're building. Okay. So like I said, domain environments are good. Otherwise, this is something to watch for. Okay. Yeah, and don't worry too much about the summary. Any questions about that? With what specs? Okay. Uh, we've got, like, I have a bunch of exercises here. What I want you to start out with is, I think let's just do RAM gathering. Okay. So we'll start with exercise 5. I kind of have them out of order a little bit, but there's 5, 6, 7, and 8. I want you to do 5 right now. So just do the first one. Let's see if I can bring that puppy up. Put it right at the top there. So this is RAM gathering. It's very simple. It's not going to take you very long. It's also kind of a nice to do, not a need to do. I will say that because I'm just going to give images to you to work with. But if you're ever interested in actually gathering these images, you know, this is the way to do it. So you're going to need WinPMem to do the capture. Okay. This is like a 20-minute job, maybe a little bit more, maybe 30 minutes. But what WinPMem is a standalone tool that can grab RAM and dump it into a binary file. Okay. Now, we're not going to get into RAM right away, but it is coming up soon, where I'm going to walk us through some analysis using the volatility tool. This is kind of just dipping your toe into how to capture that data. But what you'll find with RAM capture is because you're on a system that's using the RAM as you're trying to capture it, it's like taking a picture of a car while it's moving, you know? It's like you're going to get blurry streaks, right? So it's not going to be a completely faithful image of a particular snapshot in time. It's kind of a blurry image of a snapshot of during the period that you were doing the capture, which could be a few minutes. Okay. And so inevitably, you're going to find that, let's say you have 8 gigs of RAM and you want to capture it. By the way, I suggest you do smaller than that, so it's not too long or too big. But let's say you have 8 gigs of RAM, you may end up with a 10 gig file. Okay. And maybe even bigger. It might be a 12 gig file. There's a few reasons for this. One is data is constantly getting loaded up and taken out of RAM. And so it's playing a game of trying to keep up while it's capturing, keep up with the data that's being swapped in and out. Okay. But also, if you go to the C drive, and if we just go and we turn on where is it? Where is it? Where is it? I don't want details. Show hidden items. I want more than this. Hold on a second. Options. Here we go. Okay. So you hit the ellipsis in Windows 11. You go to Options. You go to View. I want to show hidden files, and I also I don't want to hide protected operating system files. So I go OK. And if you go down, you're going to see a couple of, well, 3 files in Windows 11. There's hyperfile.sys, pagefile.sys, swapfile.sys. Okay. Now, what those files are is kind of like overflow for RAM. So if you think about RAM as, let's say you have a closet, okay? The closet is your RAM. And you're putting processes into your closet. That's the clothing that you're putting in, okay? Now, if it so happens that you have more clothes than you can fit into your closet, so you have more programs that you want to run than you actually have RAM, instead of having the closet explode because you're shoving too much into it, or in other words, instead of having the computer crash because you've exceeded your RAM, what we do is we have this overflow bucket where we can put things temporarily, okay? And that's usually called the page file in Windows, okay? Think of it like a piece of luggage where you can store extra clothes that you don't need. Like say it's the summer, you put your winter clothes in the luggage, stick it under the bed, okay? The idea here is that if you have processes that aren't active at the moment, you can send them over to the page file to free up RAM so that the processes that are running, can make use of RAM more effectively, okay? The good side here is that it produces more stability for your system, so it's not going to crash. The downside is that page files are located on your file system. They're a lot slower than RAM, right? So if I'm looking for a sweater, it's summer, but it's a cold day, I want a sweater. It's not in my closet because I shoved it away, under the bed in my luggage. Well, that's a pain, right? Page file is the same. There's a cost to going to the page file and using it. Okay? But it maintains stability. It allows the closet to actually be more usable. Okay. The Hyper file is very similar, except it's used for suspension. So when you suspend your virtual machine or your host, what happens is the RAM that's actively running gets written to a file. That's your Hyper file. Okay. And then when you bring it back from resume, it loads everything back up into RAM again. Okay, so it's really, like you can see, mine is 13 gigs in size. And that's how much RAM I probably used the last time I suspended the system. Okay. The page file, on the other hand, is only using 2 gigs, and that's just saying my RAM is enough. The page file is just for the odd little bit and piece there. that's not very active right now. Now swapfile.sys, you notice that this is not very busy at all. Okay, this is usually Windows Universal Apps. Okay, they have a separate, essentially a separate page file. I don't use a lot of Windows apps, and so I don't actually need a lot of swap file for it. Okay, but if you did use them a lot more, that would be a larger file. Okay, all of these, when you're doing a capture of RAM, you can actually tell the tool WinPMem. You could say, yeah, I want you to grab those as well. Okay, so what that might mean is that even though I have 32 gigs of RAM, first of all, as I'm capturing it, maybe I'm capturing 35 because things are changing. Second of all, it might also capture my Hyper file, which is another 13, and it may, if I tell it to, it'll also capture the page file, which is another 2, right? And then I can use all of that data to analyze what was going on in RAM at the time. Okay. So that's what I'm going to have you do before the break. And then after the break, we're going to get back and we're going to start talking about file systems. We're going to start talking about more RAM analysis, so not just capture, but actually working with captures and extracting data from them. And we'll do some file recovery, some disk capture, and we'll start working with one of these suites of tools that can actually analyze disks. Okay. All right, that was a bit of a long spiel, but if there's no questions, I'll let you guys go. You can have yourselves a good day. Question?